David Williams checked his watch as he pulled out of the parking lot. It was almost midnight, and the software company's offices were completely empty, except for the security guard who had waved goodbye to him just minutes earlier. The deadline for the new mobile app had been pushing everyone to work late, but David didn't mind. He actually enjoyed the quiet hours when he could focus without interruptions. The streets were mostly empty as he drove through downtown, heading toward his neighborhood about 15 minutes away. David had bought his house in Oakwood Hills 2 years ago after getting promoted to senior developer. It was a nice area with tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes. His neighbors were mostly families with kids, and everyone seemed friendly enough, though he hadn't gotten to know many people yet. As he turned onto Maple Street, David noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. The car seemed to be following pretty close, but he didn't think much of it. Maybe someone else was heading home late from work, too. He slowed down a bit to let them pass, but the car stayed right behind him. When David reached the intersection at Maple and Oak, he saw the yellow light ahead. He had enough time to make it through safely, so he continued through the intersection just as the light turned red. That's when the flashing lights appeared behind him. David's heart sank a little. He pulled over to the side of the road and turned off his engine, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel like his father had taught him years ago. One police car had pulled him over, but as he sat there waiting, 2 more patrol cars arrived and parked nearby. This seemed like a lot of officers for a simple traffic stop. The first officer walked up to his window, shining a bright flashlight directly into David's face. David squinted but tried to remain calm and polite. "License and registration," the officer said without any greeting. "Of course, officer," David replied, reaching slowly for his wallet. "May I ask what I was pulled over for?" "You ran that red light back there," the officer said, examining David's license. David was confused. He was pretty sure the light had still been yellow when he went through, but he didn't want to argue. "I thought it was still yellow, but I might have been mistaken. I apologize if I was wrong." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he walked back to his patrol car with David's documents. David could see him talking to the other officers who had arrived. This was taking much longer than a normal traffic stop should take. After about 10 minutes, the officer returned, but this time he brought one of his colleagues with him. The second officer was larger and seemed more aggressive in his approach. "Mr. Williams," the first officer said, "we're going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "Why?" David asked, genuinely confused. "Is there a problem with my license or registration?" "Just step out of the car, sir," the second officer said in a tone that made it clear this wasn't really a request. David complied, getting out slowly and keeping his hands visible. "Can you tell me what this is about?" "I was just driving home from work." "We can smell marijuana coming from your vehicle," the first officer said. "We need to search your car." David was shocked. He had never used any drugs in his life, and his car certainly didn't smell like marijuana. "Officer, I don't use drugs, and there's nothing illegal in my car. Do you have a warrant to search it?" "We don't need a warrant if we have probable cause," the second officer said, moving closer to David. "And the smell of drugs gives us probable cause." "I understand, but I'm telling you there are no drugs in my car," David said, trying to stay calm. "I don't consent to a search, and I'd like to exercise my constitutional rights." The officers looked at each other, and David could sense their frustration growing. The third officer, who had been standing by his patrol car, now walked over to join the conversation. "Are you refusing to cooperate with our investigation?" the third officer asked. "No, sir, I'm cooperating fully," David replied. "I've provided my license and registration, and I've answered your questions. I just don't consent to a search of my vehicle without a warrant." "Why are you being so difficult?" the second officer asked, his voice getting louder. "If you have nothing to hide, why won't you let us search your car?" David had studied his constitutional rights and knew that refusing a search wasn't illegal, but he could feel the tension rising. "It's not about having something to hide. It's about my constitutional rights. I have the right to refuse a search without a warrant." The first officer stepped closer. "You're starting to sound pretty suspicious to me. Maybe we should call in a drug dog." "That's your choice, officer," David said, "but I still don't consent to a search." At this point, David decided he should start recording the interaction. He had heard too many stories about traffic stops going wrong, and he wanted to protect himself. He slowly reached for his phone, making sure to announce what he was doing. "I'm going to take out my phone to record this interaction," he said clearly. "I have the right to record police officers in public." "Put that phone away," the second officer shouted, immediately becoming more aggressive. "Recording police is legal," David said, holding up his phone. "I'm not interfering with your investigation. I'm just documenting what's happening." The third officer quickly moved around behind David while the second officer grabbed for his phone. "You're interfering with police business," the second officer said as he wrestled the phone away from David. "I wasn't interfering," David protested. "I was just recording from where I was standing." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," the first officer commanded. "What are you arresting me for?" David asked, but he complied to avoid any physical confrontation. "Resisting arrest and interfering with police business," the second officer said as he put handcuffs on David. "But I wasn't resisting anything," David said, confused and frustrated. "I answered all your questions and provided my documents. I just didn't consent to a search." "You were being uncooperative and interfering with our investigation," the third officer said. As they walked David toward one of the patrol cars, he noticed that several neighbors had come out of their houses to see what was happening. Some were recording with their phones from their front yards. David felt embarrassed and worried about what his neighbors would think. "Can I call someone to let them know what's happening?" David asked. "You can make your phone call from the station," the first officer replied. They put David in the back of the patrol car, and he sat there for another 20 minutes, while the officers searched his vehicle anyway. They went through everything: his glove compartment, under the seats, in the trunk, even inside his laptop bag. They found absolutely nothing illegal. During the search, David thought about how quickly everything had escalated. He had been polite and respectful throughout the entire interaction. He had provided his license and registration immediately. He had answered their questions honestly. The only thing he had done was refuse to consent to a search and try to record the interaction, both of which were his legal rights. As they drove to the police station, David wondered if this would have happened if he had been a different color. He had heard stories from other people about similar experiences, but he had always hoped that being educated, well-dressed, and polite would protect him from this kind of treatment. Now he was beginning to realize that maybe those things didn't matter as much as he had thought. At the station, they processed him like any other criminal. They took his fingerprints, his photo, and put him in a holding cell. The whole experience felt surreal. Just 2 hours earlier, he had been working quietly at his computer, solving coding problems and thinking about the presentation he needed to give the next day. Now he was sitting in jail, accused of crimes he didn't commit. The holding cell was small and cold, with concrete walls and a metal bench. There were a few other people there, and everyone looked tired and frustrated. David didn't talk to anyone. He just sat there thinking about what had happened and trying to figure out what he should do next. When they finally let him make his phone call, David called his friend Kevin, who was a lawyer. Kevin wasn't a criminal defense attorney, but he knew enough to give David some basic advice. "Don't say anything else to the police," Kevin told him. "I'm going to find you a good criminal defense lawyer, and we'll get you out of there as soon as possible." David spent the rest of the night in that cell, unable to sleep and replaying the events over and over in his mind. He kept thinking about how the officers had claimed they smelled marijuana when there definitely wasn't any in his car. He thought about how they had become aggressive the moment he mentioned his constitutional rights. And he kept wondering why 3 patrol cars had been needed for a simple traffic stop. When morning finally came, David was exhausted and confused. A bail bondsman that Kevin had arranged came to get him, and David was released after posting bail. As he walked out of the jail, he felt like everyone was looking at him differently. He was no longer just David Williams, software developer and homeowner. Now he was David Williams, the guy who had been arrested. The whole experience had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He had always believed that if you followed the rules and respected authority, you would be treated fairly. But last night had shown him that maybe the world didn't work the way he had thought it did. And as he got into Kevin's car to go home, David woke up the next afternoon feeling like he hadn't slept at all. His body was sore from the uncomfortable jail cell, and his mind was still racing from everything that had happened. He had called in sick to work, something he rarely did, but he couldn't imagine sitting at his computer and pretending everything was normal. Kevin had already been busy making phone calls. He had found a criminal defense attorney named Patricia Chen, who specialized in cases involving police misconduct. She was coming over that afternoon to discuss David's case and figure out the best way to handle the charges. While David was making coffee, his phone started buzzing with notifications. He had dozens of missed calls, text messages, and social media notifications. At first, he thought maybe his coworkers were checking on him since he had called in sick. But as he started reading the messages, he realized something much bigger was happening. His neighbor from across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez, had sent him a link to a video on social media with the message, "David, I think you need to see this. I'm so sorry this happened to you." David clicked on the link and couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a video of his arrest from the night before, but it wasn't the recording he had tried to make with his phone. One of his neighbors had been recording from their bedroom window, and they had captured the entire interaction on video. The video was crystal clear. You could see David being polite and respectful throughout the entire encounter. You could hear him asking reasonable questions and calmly explaining his rights. You could see that he never physically resisted or became aggressive. And most importantly, you could see how the officers escalated the situation, even though David was cooperating. The video had been posted just a few hours earlier, but it already had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. People were sharing it rapidly, and David could see that it was spreading to other social media platforms too. Kevin arrived just as David was reading through some of the comments. Many people were expressing outrage at how David had been treated. Others were sharing their own similar experiences. Some were calling for the officers to be held accountable. But there were also negative comments from people who thought David should have just let the officers search his car. "This is actually good news," Kevin said after watching the video. "This gives us clear evidence of what really happened. The officer's report says you were uncooperative and resisting, but this video shows that's not true at all." Attorney Patricia Chen arrived an hour later. She was a small woman in her 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She had handled dozens of cases involving police misconduct, and she knew exactly what to look for. "I've already seen the video," she said as she sat down at David's kitchen table. "It's very compelling evidence. The officers clearly violated your constitutional rights, and their justification for the arrest doesn't hold up under scrutiny." Patricia explained that David was facing 2 charges: resisting arrest and interfering with police business. Both were misdemeanors, but they could still result in fines, community service, or even jail time if he was convicted. "The problem is that these charges are often used when officers don't have any real evidence of wrongdoing," she said. "They arrest someone, and then they charge them with resisting arrest to justify the arrest after the fact. It's a circular logic that, unfortunately, works in many cases." But Patricia was optimistic about David's case because of the video evidence. "This shows clearly that you weren't resisting. You were polite, you complied with their commands, and you were just exercising your constitutional rights. Any reasonable judge or jury should be able to see that." As they were talking, David's phone kept buzzing with notifications. The video was continuing to spread, and local news stations were starting to pick up the story. Patricia suggested that David might want to consider speaking to the media. "Sometimes public pressure can help ensure that justice is done," she said, "but you need to be careful. Anything you say publicly could potentially be used against you in court." David wasn't sure he wanted to become a public figure. He was a private person who just wanted to do his job and live his life quietly. But he was also angry about what had happened to him, and he didn't want other people to go through the same experience. By evening, the video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. David started getting calls from reporters asking for interviews. Several civil rights organizations reached out offering support. Even some celebrities had shared the video and commented on the injustice of the situation. The local news ran a story about David's arrest during their evening broadcast. They interviewed the neighbor who had recorded the video, and they also tried to get a comment from the police department. The police spokesman said they couldn't comment on an ongoing case, but they were reviewing the incident. David decided to give one interview to the local news station. He was nervous about being on camera, but Patricia helped him prepare. She told him to stick to the facts, stay calm, and focus on the constitutional issues rather than making it personal. During the interview, David explained what had happened from his perspective. He talked about how he had been polite and cooperative throughout the encounter. He explained that he had simply exercised his constitutional right to refuse a search and to record the interaction, and he emphasized that he had never physically resisted or done anything to justify being arrested. "I was just trying to get home from work," David said. "I never expected to end up in jail for exercising my constitutional rights." The interview aired that night and was immediately posted online. It generated even more discussion and debate. Supporters praised David for speaking out and for remaining calm and articulate. Critics questioned whether there was more to the story that the video didn't show. Over the next few days, David's life became completely different. He couldn't go anywhere without people recognizing him from the news. Some people stopped him to express support. Others gave him dirty looks or made comments under their breath. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had always preferred to stay out of the spotlight. At work, his co-workers had mixed reactions. Most were supportive and expressed outrage at how he had been treated, but a few seemed uncomfortable around him, as if they weren't sure what to think. His boss told him that the company supported him and that he could take whatever time he needed to deal with the legal issues. Patricia was working on getting the charges dropped, but she explained that it might take time. "These cases often move slowly," she said, "but the video evidence is so clear that I'm confident we can get a favorable outcome." Meanwhile, David started looking into the officers who had arrested him. He learned their names from the police report: Officer Johnson, Officer Martinez, and Officer Thompson. He was curious about whether they had a history of similar incidents. What he found surprised him. When he searched online, he discovered that Officer Johnson had been involved in several other controversial arrests over the past few years. There were news articles about other people who claimed they had been mistreated by the same officer. Some had filed complaints, but none of the complaints had resulted in any disciplinary action. David also noticed something else that troubled him. When he looked at the dates and locations of these other incidents, he realized that many of them had happened in or near his neighborhood. It seemed like this group of officers was frequently patrolling his area and frequently getting into confrontations with residents. He started thinking back to his own experiences over the past few months. This wasn't the first time he had been pulled over in his neighborhood. In fact, it was the fourth time since he had moved there 2 years ago. Each time the officers had been different, but now that he thought about it, he was pretty sure Officer Johnson had been involved in at least 2 of the previous stops. David had always assumed that being pulled over frequently was just bad luck, or maybe because he was still learning the local traffic patterns, but now he was beginning to wonder if there was a pattern. Were these officers specifically targeting him? And if so, why? He mentioned his suspicions to Patricia during their next meeting. She took notes carefully and asked him to write down everything he could remember about each of the previous traffic stops. She also suggested that they might want to file a complaint with the police department's Internal Affairs Division. "Even if the criminal charges get dropped, we might want to pursue a civil rights lawsuit," she said. "If you're being systematically harassed, that's a violation of your constitutional rights." The idea of filing a lawsuit made David nervous. He didn't want to be seen as someone who was just trying to get money out of a bad situation. But Patricia explained that civil rights lawsuits weren't just about compensation. They were also about accountability and making sure that the same thing didn't happen to other people. As the days passed, David found himself becoming more and more angry about what had happened, not just the arrest itself, but the bigger picture of what it represented. He had worked hard to build a good life for himself. He had bought a house in a nice neighborhood, earned a good living, and tried to be a responsible citizen. But apparently, none of that mattered when it came to how he was treated by the police. 2 weeks after his arrest, David was sitting in Patricia's office with a stack of documents spread across her conference table. What had started as a simple criminal defense case was turning into something much more complicated and disturbing. Patricia had filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get copies of police reports from David's neighborhood over the past 2 years. The request had taken weeks to process, but when the documents finally arrived, they revealed a pattern that neither David nor Patricia had expected to find. "Look at this," Patricia said, pointing to a spreadsheet she had created. "In the past 18 months, there have been 47 traffic stops in your neighborhood. 39 of those stops involved Black or Latino drivers. Only 8 involved white drivers." David studied the numbers. His neighborhood was diverse, with roughly equal numbers of white, Black, and Latino families. The traffic stop statistics didn't match the demographics at all. "But it gets worse," Patricia continued. "Of those 39 stops involving people of color, 28 resulted in the driver being asked to consent to a vehicle search. Of the 8 stops involving white drivers, only 1 was asked to consent to a search. The pattern was so clear that it couldn't be a coincidence." David looked at the names of the officers involved in these stops. Officers Johnson, Martinez, and Thompson, the same 3 who had arrested him, were involved in more than half of the incidents. "They're targeting people," David said, feeling sick to his stomach. "They're specifically going after Black and Latino drivers in my neighborhood." Patricia nodded grimly. "It looks that way, but we need more evidence before we can prove it in court." They had also received responses to their requests for information about complaints against the 3 officers. Officer Johnson had 7 complaints filed against him in the past 3 years, all from people of color who claimed they had been stopped without justification or treated roughly during traffic stops. Officer Martinez had 4 similar complaints, and Officer Thompson had 3. None of the complaints had resulted in any serious disciplinary action. Most were marked as unfounded or not sustained after brief investigations. A few resulted in verbal warnings or mandatory retraining sessions. David was frustrated by the lack of accountability. How can they have so many complaints against them and still be out there doing the same thing? "Unfortunately, it's very common," Patricia explained. "Police departments often protect their officers even when there's a pattern of problematic behavior. It usually takes something very dramatic to force them to take action." They had also been reaching out to other people who had been stopped by these officers. Patricia had hired a private investigator named Tom Bradley to help track down victims and gather their stories. Tom had found 12 people who were willing to talk about their experiences with Officers Johnson, Martinez, and Thompson. Their stories were remarkably similar to David's. They had been pulled over for minor traffic violations or sometimes for no clear reason at all. They had been asked to consent to searches of their vehicles. When they refused or asked questions, the officers became aggressive and hostile. 5 of these people had been arrested on charges like resisting arrest or interfering with police business, the same charges David was facing. In each case, the charges were eventually dropped or reduced to minor infractions, but not before the victims had spent time in jail and money on legal fees. One of the victims was a woman named Angela Thompson, who lived just 3 blocks from David. She was a nurse at the local hospital who had been pulled over 4 times in the past year while driving to or from work. Each time, the officers claimed she had committed some minor traffic violation, but Angela was certain she had done nothing wrong. "I started taking different routes to work because I was afraid of being stopped again," Angela told David when they met at a coffee shop near the hospital. "But it didn't matter. They found me anyway." Angela's experiences were particularly troubling because she worked night shifts, which meant she was often driving through the neighborhood late at night when there were fewer witnesses around. During one stop, Officer Martinez had made inappropriate comments about her appearance and asked personal questions that had nothing to do with why she was stopped. "I filed a complaint with the police department," Angela said, "but they told me it was just a misunderstanding and that Officer Martinez was just being friendly. They said there was no evidence of wrongdoing." Another victim was a man named Carlos Rivera, who owned a small landscaping business. He had been stopped multiple times while driving his work truck through the neighborhood. The officers always claimed they were investigating reports of burglaries or vandalism, and that his truck matched the description of a suspect vehicle. But the description was always so vague, Carlos explained. "A white pickup truck or a man in work clothes. That could describe half the vehicles and workers in the city. Carlos had eventually stopped taking jobs in David's neighborhood because he was tired of being harassed. He estimated that the constant stops had cost him thousands of dollars in lost business. The most disturbing case involved a teenager named Anthony Washington who had been visiting his girlfriend's family in the neighborhood. Anthony was 17 years old and had been walking to the bus stop when officers Johnson and Thompson stopped him and demanded to see identification. When Anthony asked why he was being stopped, the officers said they were investigating reports of suspicious activity. They searched his backpack and found nothing illegal, but they still held him for 2 hours while they verified his story by calling his girlfriend's family. They made me sit on the curb in handcuffs while all my girlfriend's neighbors watched, Anthony told David. It was humiliating, and the worst part was that I hadn't done anything wrong. I was just walking to catch the bus. As David heard these stories, he realized that what had happened to him was part of a much larger pattern of harassment and intimidation. The 3 officers weren't just making random mistakes or having bad days. They were systematically targeting people of color in his neighborhood. Patricia and Tom were also investigating the officers' patrol patterns and assignment schedules. They discovered that officers Johnson, Martinez, and Thompson often worked together as a team, even though they were officially assigned to different units. They frequently requested overtime shifts that allowed them to patrol David's neighborhood during evening and late-night hours. This suggests that they were specifically choosing to work in this area, Patricia explained. They weren't just randomly assigned there, they were seeking out opportunities to patrol your neighborhood. The investigation also revealed that the 3 officers had received commendations from their supervisors for their proactive policing in reducing crime in David's neighborhood. They had been praised for making numerous traffic stops and arrests, which helped improve the department's statistics. So they were actually being rewarded for this behavior, David said, shaking his head in disbelief. It appears so, Patricia replied, which suggests that the problem goes beyond just these 3 officers. Their supervisors were either unaware of what was really happening, or they were choosing to ignore it because the officers were producing good numbers. David was beginning to understand that fighting his individual case might not be enough. The problem was systemic, and it would require a broader approach to fix it. Patricia suggested that they consider filing a federal civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983, which allows people to sue government officials who violate their constitutional rights. Such a lawsuit could potentially include not just the 3 officers, but also their supervisors and the police department itself. We would need to prove that there was a pattern and practice of constitutional violations, Patricia explained. But based on what we've found so far, I think we have a strong case. David was also contacted by investigative journalists from the local newspaper and television station, who were interested in doing a deeper investigation into the police department's practices. They had heard about his case and wanted to examine whether similar patterns existed in other neighborhoods. One of the journalists, Rachel Martinez from Channel 7 News, had been investigating police misconduct for several years. She explained that David's case fit into a broader pattern she had been documenting across the city. We've found evidence of similar targeting in at least 3 other neighborhoods, Rachel told David during a phone interview. The common factor seems to be that these are areas where the demographics have been changing, with more people of color moving into traditionally white neighborhoods. This revelation made David think about his own neighborhood's recent history. When he had bought his house 2 years ago, the real estate agent had mentioned that the area was up and coming, and that property values were rising as more young professionals moved in. David had assumed this was just normal urban development, but now he wondered if there was more to it. Rachel's investigation had found that in several neighborhoods across the city, there had been complaints from longtime residents about outsiders moving in and changing the character of their communities. Some of these complaints had been directed to city council members and police. 3 months into the investigation, David thought he had seen the worst of what was happening in his neighborhood. The pattern of discriminatory traffic stops was bad enough, but what Patricia and Tom discovered next would shock everyone involved in the case. It started with a routine review of the officers' phone records. Patricia had subpoenaed the records as part of the civil rights lawsuit, expecting to find evidence of coordination between the three officers. What she found was much more disturbing. "David, you need to sit down for this," Patricia said when she called him to her office on a rainy Thursday morning. Her voice sounded different, more serious than he had ever heard it. The phone record showed that Officer Johnson had been receiving regular calls from a number that belonged to someone named Richard Stevens. Patricia had run a background check on Stevens and discovered that he was a real estate developer who owned several properties in David's neighborhood. "Why would a police officer be getting regular calls from a real estate developer?" David asked. "That's what we needed to find out," Patricia replied. She had Tom dig deeper into Stevens' background and business dealings. What they found painted a picture of a man who was deeply invested in controlling the character of David's neighborhood. Stevens owned 12 properties in the area, including several rental houses and a small apartment building. Over the past 3 years, he had been buying up properties as they came on the market, often paying above asking price to outbid other potential buyers. But Stevens wasn't just any real estate investor. Tom's investigation revealed that he had a history of discriminatory practices in his other properties around the city. 3 former tenants had filed complaints against him with the city's Fair Housing Office, claiming that he had refused to rent to them because of their race. Stevens had also been active in the neighborhood association, attending meetings and expressing concerns about what he called changes in the community character. Meeting minutes from the neighborhood association showed that Stevens had repeatedly complained about outsiders moving into the area and had pushed for increased police patrols to address what he called quality of life issues. The phone records showed that Stevens had called Officer Johnson at least twice a week for the past 6 months. The calls usually lasted between 5 and 15 minutes, and they often happened on the same days that discriminatory traffic stops occurred in the neighborhood. Patricia had also subpoenaed the officer's bank records, which revealed some very suspicious financial activity. Officer Johnson had made several large cash deposits over the past year that didn't correspond to his regular paychecks or any known sources of income. The deposits totaled more than $15,000. Officers Martinez and Thompson had similar unexplained cash deposits, though in smaller amounts. The timing of these deposits often coincided with periods of increased traffic stops in David's neighborhood. "This is looking like a corruption case," Patricia told David. "It appears that Stevens may have been paying these officers to harass people he didn't want in the neighborhood." The revelation was stunning. David had assumed he was dealing with racist police officers who were acting on their own prejudices. The idea that they might have been paid to target him and his neighbors was almost too outrageous to believe, but the evidence kept mounting. Tom had obtained security camera footage from several businesses near David's neighborhood that showed Officer Johnson's patrol car parked outside a diner where Stevens was known to eat lunch regularly. On several occasions, Stevens could be seen getting into the patrol car and having conversations with Officer Johnson. They weren't even trying to hide it, Tom told David. They were meeting in broad daylight in uniform in a police vehicle. Patricia decided they needed to try to get more direct evidence of the arrangement between Stevens and the officers. She asked Tom to conduct surveillance on Stevens and to try to record any conversations he might have about the situation. Tom spent 2 weeks following Stevens and eventually got lucky. Stevens attended a city council meeting where residents were discussing a proposed development project in another part of the city. After the meeting, Stevens was having drinks with several other real estate developers at a nearby restaurant. Tom had positioned himself at the bar where he could overhear their conversation. What he heard was recorded on a small device he had hidden in his jacket. "The key is to make the neighborhood uncomfortable for the wrong kind of people," Stevens could be heard saying on the recording. "You can't just kick them out directly, but you can make them not want to stay." One of the other developers asked how he accomplished this, and Stevens' response was chilling. "I have some friends in the police department who help me out," Stevens said. "They make sure that certain residents get extra attention when they're driving around the neighborhood. Nothing illegal, just frequent traffic stops, searches, that kind of thing. After a few months of that treatment, most people decide they'd rather live somewhere else." The other developer asked if this arrangement cost Stevens money. "A few hundred here and there," Stevens replied. "It's a business expense, much cheaper than trying to buy people out of their houses." Tom's recording was exactly the evidence they needed to prove that the harassment wasn't just random racism. It was a deliberate conspiracy to drive certain residents out of the neighborhood. Patricia immediately contacted the FBI to report the evidence of police corruption and civil rights violations. Federal agents were very interested in the case, especially since it involved both corruption and systematic violation of civil rights. Special Agent Lisa Park was assigned to lead the federal investigation. She met with David and Patricia to review all the evidence they had gathered over the past several months. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of conspiracy to violate civil rights that I've seen," Agent Park told them. "The phone records, the bank deposits, and especially the recorded conversation give us a very strong foundation for criminal charges." The FBI launched a full investigation, which included wiretaps on Stevens' phone and surveillance of all the people involved in the conspiracy. They also began investigating whether similar arrangements existed in other neighborhoods around the city. Within 2 weeks, the FBI had gathered enough evidence to seek arrest warrants. The investigation had expanded beyond just Stevens and the 3 officers. They had identified 2 other real estate developers who appeared to be involved in similar schemes in different parts of the city. They had also discovered that Stevens wasn't working alone in David's neighborhood. The investigation revealed that he was part of a group of property owners who had been meeting regularly to discuss strategies for controlling the demographics of the area. The group included Stevens, 2 other property owners, and a member of the Neighborhood Association's board of directors. They had been calling themselves the Oakwood Preservation Society and had been meeting monthly at a private club downtown. Meeting notes seized during the FBI investigation showed that the group had discussed various strategies for discouraging undesirable residents from staying in the neighborhood. These strategies included excessive police attention, complaints to city code enforcement about minor property violations, and even pressure on local businesses not to serve certain customers. "It was a coordinated campaign," Agent Park explained to David. "They had systematically planned to make life difficult for people they didn't want in the neighborhood." The most shocking discovery was that the conspiracy had been going on for more than 3 years. Stevens and his associates had successfully driven at least 15 families out of the neighborhood using these tactics. Many of these families had never realized they were being targeted. They had simply gotten frustrated with the constant police attention and decided to move somewhere else. David thought about Angela, the nurse who had been stopped multiple times while driving to work. She had mentioned that she was considering moving to a different part of the city because she was tired of being harassed. David realized that this was exactly what Stevens had been hoping would happen. The FBI investigation also revealed the full extent of the financial arrangements. Stevens had paid Officer Johnson more than $25,000 over 3 years. Officers Martinez and Thompson had each received smaller amounts, but still several $1,000s each. The money had been passed through a complex system designed to hide the transactions. Stevens would give cash to an intermediary, who would then give it to the officers. Sometimes the money was disguised as payments for security consulting or off-duty protection services. Agent Park explained that this type of arrangement was more common than most people realized. "Corruption, like this, exists in many police departments," she said. "Usually it involves drug dealers or other criminals paying officers to look the other way. But this case is unusual because the corruption was being used to systematically violate people's civil rights." The evidence was so overwhelming that Stevens and the 3 officers were arrested simultaneously on a Wednesday morning. The arrests made front-page news, and the story quickly spread to national media outlets. David watched the news coverage from his living room, feeling a mixture. 6 months after the arrests, David stood outside the federal courthouse watching as Richard Stevens was led away in handcuffs after being sentenced to 12 years in prison. It was a moment he had been waiting for since the night he was arrested, for simply trying to drive home from work. The trial had been a media sensation. For weeks, local and national news outlets had covered every detail of the conspiracy that had been designed to drive people of color out of David's neighborhood. The evidence presented in court painted a picture of systematic harassment that was even more extensive than David had initially realized. Officer Johnson received the harshest sentence, 15 years in federal prison for his role as the ringleader of the police corruption. Officers Martinez and Thompson were each sentenced to 8 years. The other members of the Oakwood Preservation Society received sentences ranging from 3 to 6 years. But the criminal convictions were just one, part of the justice that David and the other victims had been seeking. The civil rights lawsuit that Patricia had filed on behalf of David and 12 other victims had resulted in a settlement of $4.2 million from the city and the police department. David's share of the settlement was substantial, but he had already decided what he wanted to do with the money. Standing on the courthouse steps after Stevens' sentencing, he announced the creation of the Civil Rights Defense Fund, which would provide legal assistance to people facing discrimination and police misconduct. What happened to me could happen to anyone, David told the crowd of reporters and supporters who had gathered outside the courthouse. But most people don't have the resources to fight back against this kind of systematic harassment. This fund will help make sure that everyone has access to quality legal representation when their civil rights are violated. The fund would be administered by a board that included Patricia, several other civil rights attorneys, and representatives from local community organizations. They plan to provide both direct legal services and funding for important civil rights cases that might not otherwise be pursued. The impact of David's case had already extended far beyond his own neighborhood. The FBI's investigation had uncovered similar conspiracies in 3 other cities, leading to additional arrests and federal charges. Police departments across the country were reviewing their policies and training programs to prevent similar corruption. The police department in David's city had undergone major reforms. The police chief had resigned in disgrace after it was revealed that he had ignored multiple warning signs about the corrupt officers. The new chief, Maria Gonzalez, was a reform-minded leader who had been brought in specifically to clean up the department. Chief Gonzalez had implemented new policies requiring body cameras for all officers, regular audits of traffic stop data to identify discriminatory patterns, and stronger oversight of officers who received multiple complaints. She had also established a civilian review board with real power to investigate misconduct allegations. The events that led to Mr. Williams's arrest represent a complete failure of our department's leadership and oversight, Chief Gonzalez said at a press conference announcing the reforms. We are committed to rebuilding trust with the community and ensuring that this kind of corruption never happens again. The changes weren't limited to the police department. The city council had passed new ordinances strengthening fair housing, protections, and requiring more transparency in police practices. The neighborhood association in David's area had been completely restructured, with new leadership committed to inclusive community building. David had also become an unlikely spokesperson for police reform and civil rights. He had given speeches at conferences around the country, sharing his story and advocating for systemic changes to prevent discrimination and corruption. He had testified before Congress about the need for stronger federal oversight of local police departments. I never wanted to be a public figure, David told a gathering of civil rights lawyers at a conference in Washington. But I've learned that sometimes ordinary people have to stand up and fight for what's right, even when it's difficult and uncomfortable. The personal cost of his fight for justice had been significant. David had dealt with stress, anxiety, and depression during the long legal battle. He had struggled with the constant media attention and the fact that his life had been turned upside down. But he had also found a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. His relationship with his neighbors had also changed dramatically. Some of the white residents who had initially been skeptical of his claims had come forward to apologize and express support after the truth came out. Several had testified at the trials about suspicious activities they had witnessed, but hadn't understood at the time. Angela, the nurse who had been repeatedly stopped while driving to work, had become one of David's closest allies in the fight for reform. Together they had formed a neighborhood watch group focused on monitoring police activity and ensuring accountability. Before this happened, I felt like I was alone and powerless, Angela said at a community meeting 6 months after the arrests. But David's courage in fighting back showed all of us that we don't have to accept injustice. We can stand up and demand better. Carlos, the landscaping contractor who had been repeatedly harassed, had resumed taking jobs in David's neighborhood. Business was actually better than ever. as many residents made a point of hiring him to show their support for what he had endured. The changes in David's neighborhood had been dramatic. Property values had actually increased as the community came together to address the problems that had been exposed. New families were moving in, attracted by the strong community spirit and the reforms that had been implemented. But David knew that the work was far from over. The Civil Rights Defense Fund was already handling dozens of cases across the region. Many involved situations similar to David's, people who had been targeted for harassment because of their race or ethnicity. One of the fund's first major cases involved a Latino family in a nearby suburb who had been repeatedly cited for code violations that appeared to be retaliation for their complaints about discriminatory treatment. Another case involved a group of Muslim families who claimed they were being surveilled by local police without justification. The conspiracy we uncovered in my neighborhood wasn't unique, David explained to a group of law students who had invited him to speak at their university. This kind of systematic discrimination exists in communities across the country. The only difference is that we had the resources and determination to fight back and expose it. David had also used his platform to advocate for broader police reform at the state and federal level. He had supported legislation requiring police departments to collect and publish data about traffic stops, searches, and arrests broken down by race and ethnicity. He had also advocated for stronger whistleblower protections for police officers who report misconduct by their colleagues. The investigation into his case had revealed that several officers in the department had suspected that Johnson, Martinez, and Thompson were corrupt, but they had been afraid to come forward because of fear of retaliation. Good police officers shouldn't have to choose between their careers and doing the right thing, David said during testimony before the state legislature. We need to create systems that reward officers for reporting misconduct, not punish them. The federal investigation had continued to expand even after the initial arrests. FBI agents had identified similar corruption schemes in 5 other cities, leading to more than 30 additional arrests. The Justice Department had launched a comprehensive review of police practices in departments where corruption had been discovered. Agent Park, who had led the investigation into David's case, had been promoted and was now heading a new task force focused on police corruption and civil rights violations. She credited David's willingness to fight back as the key to uncovering the broader pattern of corruption. Most victims of police misconduct just want to put the experience behind them and move on with their lives, Agent Park explained. Mr. Williams' determination to get to the truth not only brought justice in his own case, but helped us uncover a much larger pattern of corruption that was affecting communities across the region. 2 years after his arrest, David was invited to speak at his company's annual meeting about leadership and social responsibility. It was a surreal moment for someone who had once just wanted to write code and avoid attention. I learned that sometimes being a good citizen means more than just following the rules and paying your taxes, David told his coworkers. Sometimes it means standing up and fighting for what's right, even when it's difficult and scary. David's manager, who had supported him throughout the legal battle, introduced him as an example of how ordinary people can make extraordinary differences in their communities. After the meeting, David drove home through his neighborhood, taking the same route he had taken that night when he was first pulled over. The streets looked the same, but everything felt different. He was no longer just a resident trying to blend in. He was someone who had helped transform his community for the better. As he pulled into his driveway, David reflected on how much his life had changed.